Hey there, history lovers. If you're getting ready to drift off, get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's travel back in time to one of the most impossible moments in human history. Tonight's story begins with King Edward II of England, the most powerful monarch in medieval Europe, stumbling through the muddy streets of St. Albans in August 1315, his royal robes soaked and filthy, desperately knocking on doors and begging strangers for a single crust of bread that simply didn't exist anywhere in his entire kingdom. Picture this: the man who commanded armies and ruled millions, reduced to a common beggar, his crown worthless against the gnawing hunger eating him alive. But here's where it gets even more surreal. While Edward II was crawling through those streets like a starving peasant, actual peasants across Europe were scraping bark from trees with their bare fingernails, chewing it like it was a feast fit for kings, because in this upside-down world, tree bark had become more valuable than gold. Imagine medieval Europe drowning under 3 straight years of apocalyptic rain, where the natural order of society had been flipped so completely that being born into royalty meant absolutely nothing, and knowing how to strip bark from an oak tree meant everything. This is the real story of when medieval Europe ate tree bark and kings begged for bread, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, and it's far stranger and darker than anything Hollywood could dream up. We're talking about a disaster so catastrophic that it turned Christians into cannibals, parents into child abandoners, and the most powerful people in the world into hollow-eyed beggars. This wasn't just a bad winter. This was the complete collapse of civilization as medieval people knew it, where the fundamental rules of who eats and who starves were thrown out and replaced with the brutal law of survival at any cost. So buckle up, because over the next hour and a half, we're going to explore how a climate disaster turned the medieval world completely upside down, how people who had never broken a law became thieves and murderers for a handful of grain, and how somehow, against all odds, humanity found ways to adapt to the unthinkable and survive the impossible. Now, to understand just how impossible this story really is, we need to travel back a few years earlier, to around 1300, when medieval Europe was living through what historians call its golden age. Picture this: for the first time in centuries, peasants actually had enough food. Not just enough to survive, mind you, but enough to feel genuinely full. Can you imagine that? In an age when most people lived and died without ever experiencing what we'd consider a decent meal, suddenly there was abundance. The population had exploded. We're talking about growth rates that wouldn't be seen again until the Industrial Revolution. England's population had tripled. France was home to 17 million people, making it the most populous kingdom in all of Europe. Towns were expanding so fast they had to build new walls every few decades. Paris had grown to over 200,000 inhabitants. London was bustling with nearly 80,000 souls. Markets were overflowing with goods from across the known world. Spices from Asia that cost more than a peasant's annual income. Wine from the sun-soaked vineyards of Bordeaux. Flemish cloth so fine it felt like liquid gold. English wool that was considered the finest in all of Christendom. Italian silk that made even hardened knights weep with desire. And here's the thing that's so crucial to our story. Medieval society was built like a pyramid. A rigid, unchangeable, divinely ordained pyramid. And everyone, absolutely everyone, knew exactly where they belonged in that pyramid. At the very top sat the kings, draped in ermine and purple silk, eating off plates made of pure silver. Their meals were legendary feasts. Roasted peacocks served with their feathers intact. Whole boars stuffed with smaller animals. Wine that flowed like rivers. Below them, the great nobles with their massive stone castles that took decades to build. These men owned thousands of acres, commanded private armies, and lived like little kings in their own domains. They hunted with packs of hounds worth more than most villages. They wore swords forged by master craftsmen whose techniques were closely guarded secrets. Then came the merchants, a relatively new class that was growing rich from the explosion in trade. These were the men who financed expeditions to distant lands, who spoke multiple languages, who understood the complex web of credit and debt that was beginning to connect cities across Europe. Below them, the skilled craftsmen with their powerful guilds. The stonemasons who built the great cathedrals. The blacksmiths who could forge everything from horseshoes to suits of armor. The carpenters whose joints were so precise they needed no nails. These men took pride in their work that bordered on religious devotion. And at the bottom, making up about 90% of the population, the peasants. The farmers who worked the land and fed everyone else. But here's what's fascinating. This wasn't seen as unfair. This was seen as God's plan. Divine order written in the very fabric of creation. The king ruled because God had anointed him. The noble fought because God had called him to warfare. The merchant traded because God had given him a head for numbers. And the peasant farmed because God had made him strong of back and willing to labor. It was theology, politics, and economics all rolled into one unbreakable system. Social mobility? Forget about it. If you were born a peasant, your children would be peasants. Your grandchildren would be peasants. Your great-grandchildren would be peasants. If you were born royal, you died royal. It was that simple, that rigid, that unchangeable. And you know what? For most of the 13th century, this system actually worked pretty well. The weather was good. Really, really good. Historians call it the medieval warm period, and it was like nature had decided to give humanity a gift. Summers were long and sunny, perfect for ripening grain. Winters were mild enough that livestock could graze almost year-round. Spring came early and stayed late. Crops grew abundantly. Harvests were so good that farmers started clearing forests to plant even more fields. There was enough food for everyone, from the king in his castle down to the lowest serf in his hovel. But abundance, as we're about to see, can be incredibly dangerous. Because when you have abundance, you get comfortable. You start to believe that the good times will last forever. You stop preparing for disaster. You forget that nature doesn't care about your social pyramid, your divine right to rule, or your carefully organized hierarchy. You assume that God's favor will continue indefinitely. You build your entire civilization on the assumption that next year will be just like this year. And when nature decides to remind you who's really in charge, well, the results can be absolutely catastrophic. But then, in the autumn of 1314, something started to go wrong. Really wrong. It began subtly, the way most disasters do. Just a bit more rain than usual. Nothing to panic about, right? Except the rain didn't stop. October passed with almost constant drizzle. November brought downpours that turned roads into rivers. December arrived with what chroniclers described as unnatural storms that seemed to come from nowhere and strike with impossible fury. By January 1315, even the most optimistic farmers were starting to worry. This wasn't normal weather. This was something else entirely. Something that defied every pattern they'd learned from generations of their ancestors. Picture this: peasants who could predict the weather better than modern meteorologists, suddenly finding themselves completely lost. These were people who could smell rain coming 3 days away. Who knew exactly when to plant, when to harvest, when to bring the livestock in from the fields. Their grandfathers had taught them the signs. The way birds flew before a storm. The color of the sunset that meant clear skies ahead. The feel of the wind that promised a harsh winter. But now, none of it made sense anymore. The birds were flying in circles, confused and disoriented. The wind patterns were completely chaotic. One day it would blow warm from the south, the next day cold from the north, sometimes changing direction 3 times in a single afternoon. And the rain. Well, the rain. It wasn't like any rain they'd ever seen before. It came in sheets so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. It fell with such violence that it stripped leaves from trees and turned gentle streams into raging torrents that swept away bridges that had stood for centuries. But here's what made it truly terrifying: it never really stopped. Even on the dry days, there was this constant mist, this perpetual dampness that seeped into everything. Grain stored in barns that had kept perfectly dry for decades suddenly started sprouting mold. Clothes never dried completely. Fires were almost impossible to light because even the wood was soaked through. People started developing strange ailments. Joint pains that wouldn't go away. Persistent coughs that seemed to come from the dampness itself. And the smell. God, the smell. Everything smelled of rot and decay. The very air seemed to be decomposing. Now, you have to understand, medieval people were used to bad weather. They'd lived through harsh winters, brutal summers, terrible storms. But they'd never experienced anything like this sustained assault from the sky. This wasn't just bad weather. This felt personal. Like God himself had turned his face away from them. Like the very heavens were weeping for some unforgivable sin. The chroniclers of the time started using language they'd never used before. Miraculous rain that fell day and night without ceasing. Weather so strange that it seemed to violate the natural order itself. One monk described it as rain that fell, as if the windows of heaven had been opened again, referring to the biblical flood that had destroyed the world in Noah's time. And the timing couldn't have been worse. This was supposed to be the season when farmers prepared for spring planting. When they repaired their tools, sorted their seeds, planned their crops. Instead, they found themselves huddled in their homes, watching helplessly as their carefully ordered world began to dissolve. The social pyramid was still intact. The king still sat on his throne. The nobles still commanded their lands. But for the first time in living memory, there was a sense that maybe, just maybe, the natural world didn't care about human hierarchies. Maybe the rain that fell on the king's castle was the same rain that fell on the peasant's hovel. Maybe nature recognized no lords, no serfs, no divine right to anything. And as 1314 turned to 1315, as the rain continued to fall with supernatural persistence, a terrible thought began to creep into people's minds. What if this wasn't just bad weather? What if this was the end of the world as they knew it? What if everything they'd built, everything they'd taken for granted, everything that seemed as permanent as the stones of their cathedrals, was about to wash away in the endless, impossible rain? And then spring arrived. Or what should have been spring. March 1315 came not with the gentle warmth and sprouting buds that farmers had counted on for generations, but with rain so violent and relentless that chroniclers ran out of words to describe it. Picture this: rain that didn't just fall but attacked. Rain that came down in torrents so thick they looked like solid walls of water crashing from the sky. Rain that fell with such fury that it sounded like armies marching across rooftops, like giants pounding drums made from the very clouds themselves. And it never ever stopped. We're not talking about April showers here. We're talking about a meteorological apocalypse that seemed designed specifically to destroy human civilization. The spring planting season, the most critical time in the entire agricultural calendar, became impossible. Farmers would wade out into their flooded fields, trying desperately to sow their seeds, only to watch helplessly as the precious grain was immediately washed away by rushing water. Can you imagine the desperation? These were men whose entire existence depended on getting crops in the ground at exactly the right time. Their fathers had taught them. Their grandfathers had taught them. For centuries the timing had been perfect. But now the fields weren't fields anymore. They were lakes. Vast, muddy, stinking lakes where wheat and barley and oats were supposed to be growing. The few farmers who managed to get some seeds planted watched in horror as the endless rain turned their carefully prepared soil into a swampy mess that couldn't support any kind of plant life. Seeds that should have been sprouting were instead floating on the surface like tiny boats on a miniature ocean. And the smell. God, the smell of rotting vegetation was everywhere. Plants that had managed to poke through the waterlogged earth immediately began to decay. The air itself seemed poisoned with the stench of decomposition. But here's where it gets really nightmarish. The rain wasn't just destroying this year's crops. It was destroying the foundation of medieval agriculture itself. You see, medieval farming depended on a delicate balance. Farmers saved a portion of their harvest as seed for next year. They carefully stored grain in barns designed to keep it dry and safe. They planned years in advance, setting aside the best specimens for planting. But the supernatural dampness was seeping into everything. Grain that had been perfectly preserved for months suddenly started sprouting in storage. Or worse, it started rotting. Barns that had protected harvests for generations were no match for this relentless moisture. Farmers opened their carefully sealed containers to find not the golden grain they'd counted on for survival, but black, moldy sludge that smelled like death itself. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine being a medieval farmer, watching the seeds your grandfather saved, that your father protected, that you'd guarded like precious jewels, turning into putrid mush before your eyes. This wasn't just the loss of a season's work. This was the destruction of the genetic heritage that had sustained communities for centuries. And the rain kept falling. May should have brought warmer weather and the first green shoots of growing crops. Instead, it brought floods that swept away entire villages. Rivers that had meandered peacefully for generations suddenly became raging monsters that devoured bridges, mills, and anything else unfortunate enough to be in their path. The chroniclers describe scenes that sound almost biblical. Entire valleys filled with water overnight. Church bells submerged beneath muddy torrents. Livestock drowned by the thousands, their bloated carcasses floating downstream like grotesque reminders of nature's power. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the realization that was beginning to dawn on the more intelligent observers. This wasn't just bad weather. This was climate change on a scale that medieval minds couldn't fully comprehend. The medieval warm period, that golden age of abundance we talked about earlier, was ending. The climate that had supported the population explosion, the economic growth, the entire structure of medieval civilization, was disappearing. And in its place was coming something colder, wetter, and infinitely more hostile to human life. By June, even the most optimistic souls had to face the truth. There would be no harvest in 1315. The fields that should have been golden with ripening grain were underwater graveyards of rotted dreams. The carefully ordered world of medieval agriculture had been swept away by an endless torrent that seemed to mock every human attempt at planning, preparation, and civilization itself. Now here's where our story takes a turn that would have been absolutely unthinkable just months earlier. As the reality of the failed harvest began to sink in, something extraordinary started happening. something that violated every rule of medieval society. For the first time in living memory, rich and poor found themselves in the exact same desperate situation. Picture this scene because it's almost impossible to believe. Outside the few bakeries that still had flour, lines began forming. Long, desperate lines of hungry people. But these weren't just the usual poor peasants and beggars that you'd expect. No, no, no. Standing right next to the ragged serfs were merchants in their fine wool cloaks. Minor nobles with their family crests embroidered on their tunics. Craftsmen who just weeks earlier had been prosperous enough to eat meat every day. All of them, every single one, waiting in the same line. Hoping for the same scraps. Praying to the same God for the same miracle. Can you imagine how shocking this was? In medieval society, a peasant wouldn't dare stand in the same line as a noble. Hell, a peasant would throw himself into the mud just to let a nobleman's horse pass by. But hunger, it turns out, is the great equalizer. Hunger doesn't care about your bloodline. Doesn't care about your coat of arms. Doesn't give a damn about your divine right to anything. When your stomach is eating itself from the inside out, social protocol becomes irrelevant. And the prices? Oh my God, the prices. In England, a bushel of wheat that normally cost 2 shillings suddenly jumped to 20 shillings. Then 30. Then 40. We're talking about inflation that makes modern economic crises look like minor inconveniences. Imagine if bread suddenly cost 20 times what it did yesterday. Imagine if a single loaf required your entire month's salary. That's what medieval people were facing. But here's the truly insane part. Even at these astronomical prices, there often wasn't any bread to buy. The money you'd saved for years, the wealth you'd accumulated, the social status you'd inherited, none of it mattered if there was literally nothing to purchase. Rich merchants found themselves offering bags of gold for a moldy crust of bread, only to be told, "Sorry, we don't have any." Kings could mint new coins, but they couldn't mint new wheat. Lords could command their servants, but they couldn't command grain to grow in flooded fields. For the first time in centuries, wealth became meaningless. And this created a psychological crisis that was almost as devastating as the physical hunger. Medieval people understood poverty. They understood that peasants went hungry while nobles feasted. That was the natural order. That was God's plan. But what they couldn't understand, what their entire worldview couldn't accommodate, was the idea that everyone might go hungry together. That divine providence might not protect the blessed. That social hierarchy might not guarantee survival. The first food riots started in the summer of 1315. And here's what's fascinating about these riots. They weren't just angry peasants attacking the rich. They were desperate people of all classes turning on anyone who might have food. Merchants' houses were ransacked not by organized mobs of the poor, but by starving crowds that included other merchants. Nobles found themselves hiding from other nobles who suspected they might have hidden grain stores. The social contract that had held medieval society together for centuries was beginning to fracture. And the authorities? They were completely unprepared for this. Medieval law was designed to maintain order between different social classes, each with their clearly defined roles. But what do you do when those classes start merging into one undifferentiated mass of hungry humanity? What legal framework can handle a world where dukes and peasants are equally desperate? Governments tried to maintain the illusion of control. They issued proclamations fixing bread prices at pre-crisis levels. They threatened death for anyone caught hoarding grain. They organized public prayers and religious processions. But you can't legislate away starvation. You can't pray crops back into existence. And slowly, terrifyingly, the people in power began to realize that their power might be built on much shakier foundations than they'd ever imagined. Because if your authority depends on your ability to provide protection and prosperity, what happens when you can't protect anyone from anything, and prosperity becomes just a distant memory of better times? So what did the people in power do when faced with this unprecedented crisis? Well, they did what people in power always do when reality refuses to cooperate with their worldview. They made laws. Lots and lots of completely useless laws. King Edward II of England, the same man who would soon be begging for bread in St. Albans, issued royal proclamations with all the authority his crown could muster. He fixed the price of bread at pre-famine levels. Just like that. Problem solved, right? Wrong. Spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. See, you can't legislate scarcity out of existence. When there's no wheat to make bread, it doesn't matter if the king says bread should cost 2 pence. There's still no wheat. The bakers, faced with the impossible choice between obeying their monarch and feeding their families, simply stopped baking. Bakeries across England closed their doors rather than sell bread at prices that would bankrupt them instantly. So Edward's brilliant solution didn't create affordable bread. It created no bread at all. Meanwhile, across the channel, the French authorities tried a different approach. King Louis X, showing the kind of strategic thinking that would soon lead him to cancel an entire military campaign because his army was too hungry to fight, decided the problem was profiteering. Clearly, evil merchants were hoarding grain to drive up prices. The solution? Death penalty for anyone caught speculating on food prices. Sounds tough, right? Except here's the thing. When grain is genuinely scarce, high prices aren't speculation. They're reality. The merchants weren't creating artificial scarcity. They were responding to actual scarcity. But try explaining basic economics to a starving population. Try telling hungry people that high prices are actually a natural market response when they're watching their children waste away. The French authorities executed several grain merchants in public spectacles designed to show they were taking decisive action. The crowds cheered. Justice was served. And absolutely nothing changed. Because you can't solve a supply shortage by killing the people who are trying to manage that shortage. If anything, executing merchants made other traders reluctant to deal in grain at all. Why risk your neck trying to import food from distant regions when the government might decide you're a criminal for charging market prices? But wait, it gets even more absurd. The church, not to be outdone by secular authorities, decided this crisis required spiritual intervention. Archbishop Walter Reynolds of Canterbury organized what he called solemn processions. Picture this: thousands of people, already weakened by hunger, marching through the streets in elaborate religious ceremonies, praying for God to make the rain stop and the crops grow. Now, I'm not mocking medieval religious faith here. These people genuinely believed that natural disasters were divine punishment for human sinfulness. So from their perspective, public repentance made perfect sense. But here's what's darkly comic about it. These massive processions required people to spend what little energy they had left walking for hours instead of searching for food. They diverted precious resources toward organizing religious pageantry instead of, say, importing grain from regions that might have been less affected. And of course, holding large gatherings of malnourished people in the rain probably helped spread the diseases that were already beginning to ravage weakened populations. It was like using gasoline to put out a fire, then wondering why the flames got bigger. Local authorities weren't any better. Town councils across Europe passed ordinances prohibiting the export of grain to neighboring communities. Every village for itself, right? Except this created a domino effect of protectionism that made the crisis infinitely worse. Instead of allowing food to flow from areas with slight surpluses to areas with desperate shortages, these policies trapped what little grain existed in political boundaries that had nothing to do with economic reality. A town 50 miles away might have had some surplus wheat, but legal barriers prevented it from reaching starving communities just a day's walk away. It's like watching medieval authorities actively choose to make starvation worse in the name of solving starvation. And the enforcement? Absolutely brutal and completely pointless. Guards were posted at town gates to search travelers for hidden grain. People were tortured on suspicion of hoarding. Families were torn apart when fathers were arrested for trying to smuggle food to neighboring villages where their relatives lived. All of this violence and paranoia didn't create a single additional grain of wheat. But it did destroy the social trust and cooperation that might have helped communities weather the crisis together. Perhaps most tragically, these failed policies weren't just ineffective. They were actively counterproductive. Every execution, every feudal law, every wasted religious procession, every pointless trade barrier served to demonstrate that the people in charge had no idea what they were doing. That the social hierarchy everyone had believed in, the divine right that justified royal authority, the wisdom of the church that promised eternal salvation, none of it was equipped to handle this crisis. And as that realization spread through the population, something even more dangerous than hunger began to take hold. The loss of faith in authority itself. The growing suspicion that maybe, just maybe, the people in power were as helpless and clueless as everyone else. Now, when traditional food sources disappear and governments prove utterly useless, humans do what humans have always done. They adapt. They improvise. They discover just how far the human body can push the boundaries of what we consider edible. And in medieval Europe, during the summer and fall of 1315, people began compiling what you might call the most desperate cookbook in human history. It started with the animals that, under normal circumstances, you'd never consider food. Horses, for instance. Now, medieval people didn't eat horses. Not ever. Horses were too valuable as transportation, as farm labor, as symbols of status and power. Eating your horse was like eating your car, your tractor, and your family heirloom all rolled into one. But when you're watching your children slowly starve to death, suddenly that moral boundary starts to look awfully thin. So horses became dinner. And not just any horses. We're talking about destriers, those magnificent war horses worth more than most people's houses. Knights who had spent fortunes training and armoring their mounts found themselves slaughtering them for meat. Can you imagine the psychological trauma? These weren't just animals. They were partners, companions. Some of these knights had ridden the same horse for decades. But hunger has a way of making the unthinkable seem reasonable. Then came the dogs. Man's best friend became man's last meal. This was perhaps even more heartbreaking than the horses because dogs lived in people's homes. They played with children. They provided companionship and security. Medieval families didn't have many possessions, but most had a dog. And suddenly, that loyal animal that had been sleeping by your fire, protecting your home, playing with your kids, was looking less like a pet and more like protein. The chroniclers report that dog meat became so common in cities like Paris that butchers started displaying it openly in their shops, right next to what little beef and pork they could still find. But here's where it gets really desperate. When the horses and dogs were gone, people turned to animals that weren't just unconventional, they were actively disgusting. Rats, cats, pigeons, anything that moved and had meat on its bones. City dwellers, who normally wouldn't know how to catch a chicken if their lives depended on it, suddenly became expert trappers. They set snares for songbirds. They hunted mice with homemade spears. They discovered that even the smallest creatures could provide a few precious calories. And then came the plant matter that pushed the boundaries of what the human digestive system could handle. Tree bark. This is where our story's title comes from, and it's more horrifying than you might imagine. People weren't just randomly gnawing on trees like cartoon beavers. They developed actual techniques. The inner bark of certain trees, particularly oak, beech, and birch, could be processed into something resembling flour. You'd strip away the outer bark, scrape off the soft inner layer, dry it if possible, then grind it into powder. Mix it with whatever grain you might still have, or even just water, and you could create a substance that was technically edible. Technically. But tree bark isn't food. It's survival. It contains almost no nutrition. It's incredibly difficult to digest. It tastes like bitter wood chips mixed with despair. And eating too much of it can actually damage your intestines. But when the alternative is watching your family starve, you learn to love the taste of oak tree. People also discovered that acorns, normally fed only to pigs, could sustain human life if you knew how to process them. You had to leach out the bitter tannins by soaking them for days, changing the water repeatedly, then grinding them into meal. It was labor-intensive, time-consuming work that yielded very little nutrition. But it was something. Anything. Grass became a delicacy. Not the lawn grass we know today, but any edible vegetation people could find. Dandelions, clover, wild herbs that had previously been considered weeds suddenly became precious as gold. Families would send their children out to forage like animals, crawling through fields on their hands and knees, competing with actual animals for whatever green things they could stuff in their mouths. And here's the truly heartbreaking part. People shared this knowledge. Neighbors taught neighbors which trees had the best bark. Mothers passed down techniques for making grass soup to their daughters. Communities that had been divided by social class and economic rivalry suddenly found themselves united by the shared expertise of extreme survival. There was no shame in admitting you knew how to cook rats. No embarrassment in teaching someone else how to make tree bark bread. Because everyone was in the same boat, and that boat was sinking fast. The medieval mind, trained to see divine order in everything, struggled to make sense of this new reality where the difference between food and non-food had completely evaporated. Where survival required abandoning not just social norms but the basic categories that had defined civilized life. They were eating their way down the food chain, discovering just how much the human body could endure, just how far civilization could fall while still technically remaining civilization. But here's where our story takes the most shocking turn of all. Because while common people were learning to eat tree bark and hunt rats, something absolutely unprecedented was happening to the people who were supposed to be protected by God himself. The kings, the nobles, the entire aristocratic class that had spent centuries convinced that divine providence guaranteed their prosperity. They were starving too. And I mean really genuinely starving. Not just eating simpler food or tightening their belts. Actually experiencing the gnawing, desperate hunger that had always been reserved for the lowest peasants. Let me paint you a picture that would have been impossible to imagine just a year earlier. King Edward II of England, a man who had inherited the throne of the most powerful kingdom in Europe, a monarch who commanded armies and owned vast territories that stretched from Scotland to Wales, found himself in August 1315 traveling through the town of St. Albans with his royal entourage. Now, normally when a king traveled, it was like a moving feast. Hundreds of servants, cartloads of provisions, elaborate meals prepared by royal cooks who competed to create the most extravagant dishes. But on this particular day something went wrong. Horribly, impossibly wrong. The royal provisions had run out. The local stores that were supposed to resupply the king's party didn't exist. The grain that should have been available for purchase simply wasn't there. And so Edward II, anointed by God, crowned with sacred ceremonies, the most powerful man in England, found himself doing something no English king had probably ever done before. He went looking for food. Personally. Like a common beggar. Can you imagine the scene? This man, dressed in royal robes that cost more than most villages were worth, walking from house to house, knocking on doors, asking ordinary townspeople if they could spare some bread. The chroniclers report that he couldn't find any. Not because people were unwilling to help their king, but because there literally wasn't any bread to be found anywhere in the entire town. The King of England went to bed hungry that night. The man who was supposed to be God's representative on earth couldn't find enough food to fill his own stomach. Meanwhile, across the channel, King Louis X of France was discovering that divine right doesn't translate into military effectiveness when your army is too hungry to fight. Louis had spent months planning an invasion of Flanders, assembling one of the largest military forces France had seen in decades. Thousands of knights, tens of thousands of infantry, siege engines, supply trains, the full might of the French crown. But as his army marched north in the summer of 1315, something became painfully clear. You can't conquer territory when your soldiers are fainting from hunger. The endless rain that had destroyed the civilian food supply had also made it impossible to maintain military provisions. Supply wagons got stuck in muddy roads that had become impassable swamps. The forage that armies normally collected from the countryside didn't exist because the countryside was underwater. Horses died not in glorious battle, but from starvation and exhaustion. And the soldiers, these proud French warriors who had dreams of conquest and plunder, found themselves deserting not because they were cowards, but because they were literally too weak to continue marching. So Louis X, King of France, did something that would have been unthinkable to his ancestors. He called off the invasion. Just canceled it entirely. Sent his starving army home. Admitted to his nobles, to his enemies, to history itself, that France was too hungry to wage war. But it wasn't just kings. The entire aristocratic class was discovering that noble blood doesn't protect you from empty stomachs. Lords who owned vast estates found that their lands were worthless when those lands were underwater. Castles that had seemed like impregnable symbols of power became stone prisons where even the wealthy went hungry. Knights who had spent their lives training for war found themselves competing with peasants for scraps of food. The psychological impact was devastating. These people had built their entire identity around the idea that they were chosen by God, that their bloodlines were blessed, that their social position guaranteed not just wealth and power, but divine protection. They had genuine, sincere belief that God would never allow them to suffer the same fate as common people. But here they were, stomach deep in the same mud as everyone else, discovering that hunger doesn't read genealogies. And perhaps most crushing of all, they were learning that their subjects' loyalty had limits. Peasants who had spent their lives bowing to noble authority suddenly realized that their lords were just as helpless, just as desperate, just as mortal as everyone else. Why follow a king who can't find bread? Why respect a noble who's begging for the same scraps you are? The divine right of kings was running headfirst into the divine right of survival, and survival was winning. It was the beginning of a psychological revolution that would reshape medieval society permanently. Because once people see their gods bleed, it's very hard to go back to worshipping them. Now, when civilization fails you, when your government can't help, when even kings are begging for scraps, humans do something remarkable. They remember. Deep in their collective memory, buried under centuries of agricultural sophistication and social complexity, medieval people began to recall the survival techniques their ancient ancestors had used when the world was younger, wilder, and infinitely more dangerous. It was like watching humanity time travel backwards, shedding layers of civilized behavior until only the most primitive, most essential knowledge remained. And it started with the old women. The grandmothers who had lived through previous famines, smaller ones, regional ones, nothing like this apocalyptic disaster, but famines nonetheless. These women suddenly became the most valuable people in their communities because they remembered things that everyone else had forgotten. Which roots were safe to dig up and eat? Which berries wouldn't poison you? Which insects could provide protein when everything else was gone? Knowledge that had been dismissed as peasant superstition suddenly became life or death wisdom. Families who had looked down on their elderly relatives as useless burdens discovered that these wrinkled old women held the keys to survival itself. Grandmothers who hadn't been consulted about anything important in decades suddenly found themselves surrounded by desperate children and grandchildren, hanging on their every word as they shared secrets passed down through generations of hardship. How to find bird eggs when the birds themselves had fled. How to catch fish in streams that were barely flowing. How to identify which mushrooms growing in the perpetual dampness were edible and which would kill you in hours. But it wasn't just remembered knowledge. People started innovating, developing new survival techniques born from pure desperation. They learned to make soup from bones that had already been boiled multiple times, extracting every possible trace of nutrition. They discovered that certain leather goods, if boiled long enough, could become technically edible. Not pleasant, not nutritious, but edible. Shoe leather became a delicacy. Belt leather became dinner. Anything made from animal hide became a potential meal, no matter how tough, how old, how disgusting it might have been under normal circumstances. Children, with their natural adaptability and lack of social conditioning about what constituted proper food, often became the family experts at foraging. While adults struggled to overcome lifetimes of cultural programming about clean versus dirty, edible versus inedible, children simply ate whatever they found that didn't immediately make them sick. They became tiny hunter-gatherers, crawling through ruins and abandoned fields, finding sustenance in places that adult minds couldn't even conceive of as food sources. Worms became protein. Snails became treats. Any living thing small enough to catch and slow enough to capture became fair game. But perhaps most remarkably, people began to develop techniques for extracting nutrition from things that seemed completely inedible. They learned to leach the toxins out of certain plants by repeated washing and boiling. They discovered that some seeds and nuts that were normally poisonous could be made safe through elaborate preparation processes that took days or even weeks. Acorns, as we mentioned earlier, became a staple food, but the process of making them edible was like a primitive chemistry experiment. Soak them in water for days. Change the water repeatedly to remove the bitter tannins. Dry them. Grind them into flour. Mix them with whatever else you could find. It was time-consuming, labor-intensive work that yielded very few calories, but it was something. And in a world where something was infinitely better than nothing, these techniques became precious beyond measure. Communities began to specialize in different aspects of survival. Some families became expert at processing tree bark into something resembling flour. Others mastered the art of catching and preparing small animals. Still others developed techniques for finding and purifying water in a world where clean water was becoming almost as scarce as food. It was like watching medieval society reorganize itself around the most basic requirements of human existence, stripping away everything non-essential until only survival remained. And perhaps most importantly, people learned to share this knowledge without shame or embarrassment. In normal times, admitting you knew how to eat tree bark would have been social suicide. It would have marked you as desperately poor, as someone who had fallen so far from civilized behavior that you were barely human. But in 1315 and 1316, knowing how to eat tree bark made you a teacher, a valuable resource, someone whose knowledge could save lives. The social stigma attached to extreme survival techniques simply evaporated because everyone needed those techniques. Everyone was grateful for any information that might keep their family alive another day. It was a complete inversion of normal social values, where the most primitive knowledge became the most sophisticated wisdom, where the ability to live like an animal became the highest form of human intelligence. And then something truly terrifying began to happen. Something that medieval society was completely unprepared for. The people who had never broken a law in their entire lives, who had been raised from birth to respect authority, to honor their social betters, to live according to the rigid moral codes of Christian Europe, these fundamentally decent human beings started to become criminals. Not because they were evil. Not because they had suddenly lost their moral compass. But because the choice had become brutally simple: steal or watch your family die. Picture this transformation because it's one of the most psychologically devastating aspects of the entire crisis. A peasant farmer who had spent 40 years of his life working honestly, paying his taxes, attending church every Sunday, respecting his Lord, helping his neighbors, suddenly finding himself sneaking into his neighbor's barn at midnight, desperately searching for any grain that might have been overlooked. The same man who would have been horrified by the thought of theft just months earlier, now calculating how much he could steal without being noticed, how much he needed to keep his children alive another week. And here's what's really heartbreaking about this moral collapse. These people knew they were doing wrong. Their consciences weren't dead. Their moral training hadn't evaporated. They understood perfectly well that theft was a sin, that it was illegal, that it violated everything they had been taught about proper behavior. But they also understood that their children were dying, and that understanding trumped everything else. The chroniclers describe scenes that sound like something from a nightmare. Neighbors who had shared meals and celebrated holidays together suddenly becoming suspicious of each other, hiding what little food they had, setting traps to protect their meager supplies from people they had considered friends. Church congregations where parishioners eyed each other with suspicion during prayer, wondering who might be hiding grain, who might be planning to steal, who could be trusted and who had already crossed the line into criminality. But it wasn't just the poor turning to crime. Oh no, this moral breakdown was completely democratic. Nobles, knights, merchants, people who had never wanted for anything in their entire privileged lives, suddenly found themselves contemplating theft with the same desperate calculation as the poorest peasants. Lords who owned vast estates discovered that ownership meant nothing when those estates were underwater and worthless. Knights who had spent their lives defending property rights began stealing from each other, justifying their actions with increasingly creative interpretations of feudal law. Some claimed they were simply collecting debts owed to them. Others argued they were requisitioning supplies for military purposes. But underneath all the legal sophistry, they were just hungry people taking food from other hungry people. The breakdown of law enforcement was swift and total. How do you arrest someone for theft when the sheriff is also stealing? How do you prosecute criminals when the judges are committing the same crimes? How do you maintain order when the people responsible for maintaining order are just as desperate as everyone else? Local authorities found themselves in an impossible position. They could either enforce the law strictly, which meant executing half the population for survival crimes, or they could look the other way and watch legal civilization completely collapse. Most chose a middle path that satisfied no one and protected nothing. They prosecuted the most obvious cases, the ones they couldn't ignore, while pretending not to see the smaller thefts, the petty crimes, the gradual erosion of social order that was happening everywhere all the time. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how quickly people adapted to this new criminal reality. Behaviors that would have been shocking in 1314 became routine by 1316. Families developed elaborate systems for hiding their food supplies. Communities created informal security arrangements, taking turns guarding each other's properties. People learned to sleep lightly, to trust no one completely, to assume that anyone desperate enough might become dangerous. The social bonds that had held medieval communities together for centuries began to dissolve. Marriages became partnerships of mutual surveillance rather than love and trust. Friendships became temporary alliances based on immediate survival needs. Even family relationships became strained as parents competed with their own children for scraps of food, as siblings turned against each other, as the fundamental assumption that family members would sacrifice for each other gave way to the brutal logic of individual survival. And through it all, the people committing these crimes weren't monsters. They were ordinary human beings pushed far beyond their moral breaking point, discovering that civilization is much more fragile than anyone had ever imagined. They were learning that the difference between a law-abiding citizen and a criminal isn't moral character or divine grace. It's simply having enough food to eat. By the winter of 1315, medieval Europe had accidentally created the most comprehensive survival manual in human history. Not written down in books, mind you, but passed from person to person in desperate whispers, taught through trial and error, refined through the bitter experience of watching some techniques work and others kill the people who tried them. It was like an entire civilization had enrolled in the world's most brutal university course, Advanced Starvation Survival 101, and the curriculum was absolutely horrifying. Let's start with the tree bark techniques because this had become such a refined science that different families developed different specializations. Oak bark was considered the premium option, the filet mignon of tree bark cuisine, because it contained more nutrients and was relatively easy to digest. But you couldn't just gnaw on it like a beaver. Oh no, there was a whole process. First, you had to select the right trees, preferably younger ones where the inner bark was softer and less bitter. Then you'd carefully strip away the outer bark, revealing the pale, slightly slimy inner layer that contained whatever nutrition the tree could offer. The harvesting itself was an art form. Strip too much and you'd kill the tree, eliminating a future food source. Strip too little and you'd waste precious time and energy. People became expert at calculating exactly how much bark a tree could lose and still survive, treating each tree like a renewable resource that needed to be managed carefully. The processing was even more complex. You'd scrape off the inner bark in long, thin strips, then lay them out to dry if you could find anywhere dry in that endless rain. Once dried, the bark had to be ground into powder using whatever tools were available. Stone mortars if you were lucky, flat rocks if you weren't. The powder could then be mixed with water to create a paste, or combined with any grain you might have found to make something that was technically bread. The taste was described by chroniclers as bitter beyond description, like chewing wood mixed with dirt, but it would keep you alive. Birch bark was the middle-tier option, slightly less nutritious than oak but easier to process. Pine bark was the desperation choice, barely digestible and likely to give you severe stomach problems, but still better than nothing. People learned to identify dozens of different tree species by their bark characteristics, developing expertise that would have impressed professional botanists. But trees weren't the only source of improvised nutrition. The animal survival techniques were equally sophisticated and equally disturbing. Rats, it turns out, were excellent protein sources if you knew how to catch and prepare them properly. People developed trap systems using whatever materials they could find, creating elaborate snares that could catch multiple rats overnight. The preparation was crucial because improperly cooked rat meat could carry diseases that would kill you faster than starvation. So communities shared knowledge about cooking temperatures, about which parts of the rat were safest to eat, about how to identify sick rats that should be avoided entirely. Cats and dogs required different techniques because they were larger and more dangerous to hunt. Families would work together, using coordinated tactics to capture animals that had once been pets and companions. The psychological trauma was enormous, but hunger has a way of overriding sentiment. People learned to think of these animals not as former friends but as mobile protein sources, developing an emotional detachment that was probably necessary for psychological survival. But perhaps most remarkably, people became expert at finding protein sources that nobody had ever considered food before. Worms and insects became dietary staples. Families would dig through compost piles, searching for grubs and larvae that could be roasted over small fires. Children became particularly skilled at this kind of foraging because their smaller hands could reach into crevices that adult fingers couldn't access. The nutritional calculations were surprisingly sophisticated. People learned that certain insects provided more protein per unit weight than others. They discovered which bugs were safe to eat raw and which needed to be cooked. They developed techniques for storing insect protein, drying it into concentrated forms that could last for weeks. Even the plant-based survival techniques became incredibly advanced. People learned to identify dozens of wild plants that were technically edible, developing expertise in seasonal availability, preparation methods, and nutritional content. They discovered that certain flowers could provide vitamins that helped prevent scurvy. They learned which tree leaves could be boiled into soup that provided some caloric content. They developed techniques for finding and harvesting wild mushrooms without poisoning themselves, creating elaborate testing procedures to distinguish between edible varieties and deadly ones. And perhaps most impressively, people learned to combine these various survival foods into meals that were almost palatable. A soup made from tree bark flour, seasoned with wild herbs, thickened with ground insects, and flavored with whatever small animals they could catch. It sounds absolutely revolting, but it represented the pinnacle of survival cuisine, the result of months of desperate experimentation and hard-won knowledge. This wasn't just about staying alive anymore. This was about maintaining some semblance of civilized meal preparation even when civilization itself was falling apart. And then, in the darkest months of 1315 and 1316, medieval Europe crossed a line that no Christian society was ever supposed to cross. The chroniclers of the time, men of God who had dedicated their lives to recording history with dignity and moral clarity, began writing entries that they clearly didn't want to believe themselves. Entries that described behaviors so horrifying, so fundamentally opposed to everything medieval Christianity taught about human nature, that modern historians spent centuries debating whether these accounts could possibly be true. But they were true. Terrifyingly, undeniably, heartbreakingly true. The Bristol Chronicle records it with stark simplicity. Horse flesh and dog's flesh was accounted good meat, and some ate their own children. The Chronicle of Lanercost adds more detail. The thieves that were in prison did pluck and tear in pieces those who were newly put in, and devoured them half alive. These weren't sensationalized tabloid reports. These were official church records, written by monks and clerks who considered accuracy a sacred duty. They were describing the complete collapse of the moral boundaries that had defined Christian civilization for 1,000 years. We're talking about cannibalism. Not ritual cannibalism, not cannibalism as part of some ancient pagan tradition, but desperate, survival-driven cannibalism among people who had been raised to believe that the human body was a sacred temple of God. Parents eating their dead children rather than watching them rot when the family was already dying of starvation. Prisoners consuming recently deceased cellmates because the alternative was joining them in death. Living people being attacked and partially devoured by others who had lost all connection to their humanity except the desperate need to consume calories, any calories from any source. But here's what made it even more psychologically devastating. These people knew what they were doing was wrong. Their moral training hadn't disappeared. Their religious faith hadn't evaporated. They understood perfectly well that cannibalism was not just illegal and immoral, but represented the ultimate violation of everything they believed about human dignity, Christian virtue, and civilized behavior. They were committing acts that they themselves considered monstrous, not because they had become monsters, but because the alternative was death. And that internal conflict, that knowledge that they were destroying their own souls to save their bodies, created a psychological trauma that may have been worse than the physical starvation itself. But cannibalism wasn't even the darkest boundary that was crossed. Because there's something even more heartbreaking than parents eating their dead children. Parents killing their living children. Infanticide, the deliberate murder of infants and young children, began appearing in records across Europe. Not accidental deaths from malnutrition, but conscious decisions by parents to end their children's lives rather than watch them suffer through prolonged starvation. Some parents poisoned their youngest children, calculating that there wasn't enough food to keep everyone alive, so they might as well spare the babies the agony of slow death. Others abandoned their children in forests and wilderness areas, telling themselves that maybe, just maybe, someone else would find them and care for them, but knowing in their hearts that they were sending their own babies to die alone in the cold and rain. This is where the fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel actually comes from. It's not some charming folk story about clever children outwitting a witch. It's a cultural memory of the Great Famine, when parents across Europe were abandoning their children in the woods because there literally wasn't enough food for everyone to survive. The witch in the story who wants to eat the children? She's not some mythical monster. She's a representation of the adults who had been driven to cannibalism, who saw children not as innocents to be protected but as potential sources of nutrition. The candy house that lures the children? It represents the impossible dream of abundance in a world where sugar and bread had become more precious than gold. Even the detail about the witch fattening up the children before eating them reflects the grim reality that starving people don't have enough meat on their bones to be worth cannibalizing. Medieval people were living through a nightmare that was so traumatic, so fundamentally world-shattering, that they could only process it by turning it into fairy tales that would be told to children centuries later. And through all of this moral collapse, through all of these violations of everything they had been taught to hold sacred, people retained enough of their humanity to feel ashamed. The chronicles don't just record these acts, they record the horror and self-loathing of the people who committed them. These weren't sociopaths who felt nothing. These were ordinary human beings who had been pushed so far beyond their breaking point that they were doing things that made them hate themselves, things that they knew would damn their souls, things that they would spend whatever remained of their lives trying to forget or atone for. Now, in the middle of all this horror, all this moral collapse, all this desperate struggle for survival, something profound was happening to the very foundations of medieval society. Something that would reshape European civilization permanently. For the first time in centuries, ordinary people were looking at their kings, their lords, their entire aristocratic class, and realizing something that should have been obvious all along but had been hidden behind centuries of elaborate royal ceremony and divine right propaganda. These people were just humans. Hungry, desperate, powerless humans who bled the same blood, felt the same pain, and died the same death as everyone else. The mystique of royalty, built up over generations through elaborate coronation ceremonies, divine blessing rituals, and carefully maintained court protocols, was evaporating faster than morning dew in the face of empty royal stomachs and failed royal policies. King Edward II wasn't some divinely appointed representative of God on earth when he was crawling through St. Albans begging for bread. He was just another starving man in expensive clothes, no more capable of commanding the weather or conjuring food from thin air than the poorest serf in his kingdom. And people noticed. Boy, did they notice. Peasants who had spent their entire lives prostrating themselves before noble authority suddenly found themselves thinking forbidden thoughts. If my lord is just as hungry as I am, if his divine right can't put food on his table any more than it can put food on mine, then what exactly makes him my superior? If God's chosen representatives are suffering the same fate as everyone else, then either God has abandoned all of us equally, or maybe, just maybe, these people were never really chosen by God in the first place. It was a psychological revolution that struck at the heart of everything medieval society believed about itself. Because medieval political theory wasn't just about governance. It was about cosmic order. The king didn't just rule because he was politically powerful. He ruled because the universe itself was structured hierarchically, with God at the top, followed by angels, then earthly rulers, then nobles, then commoners, each level divinely ordained and permanently fixed. But when that cosmic order failed to protect its own highest representatives, when divine providence proved impotent against meteorological reality, the entire theoretical foundation of medieval society began to crack. And you could see this realization spreading through the population like a contagion more dangerous than any physical plague. Peasants who had automatically removed their hats in the presence of nobility started forgetting to do so. Serfs who had never questioned their obligation to work their lord's land before their own began asking uncomfortable questions about the fairness of that arrangement. Citizens who had accepted taxation as gods started wondering why they should pay for the privilege of being governed by people who couldn't govern their way out of a paper bag, let alone manage a kingdom through a climate crisis. The respect that had held medieval hierarchy together wasn't based on fear alone. It was based on the genuine belief that social superiors possessed some divine quality, some special wisdom or blessing that justified their elevated position. But when your social superiors are digging through garbage piles looking for scraps just like you are, that belief becomes very hard to maintain. When your king's royal proclamations prove to be worth less than the parchment they're written on, when your lord's commands can't make grain grow in flooded fields, when your bishop's prayers seem to bounce off the sky without effect, the entire social contract starts to look like an elaborate scam designed to benefit people who aren't actually any better than you are. Some nobles tried to maintain their authority through increased brutality, as if physical force could substitute for lost legitimacy. But brutality requires resources, and resources were exactly what everyone lacked. You can't maintain a private army when you can't feed the soldiers. You can't intimidate your subjects from a position of strength when everyone can see that you're just as weak and desperate as they are. Other aristocrats attempted to maintain their status through elaborate displays of whatever wealth they still possessed, but this backfired spectacularly. Flaunting your remaining resources while everyone around you was starving didn't inspire respect. It inspired rage. It marked you as a target for the very people whose loyalty you were trying to retain. But perhaps most tellingly, many nobles simply abandoned their pretensions entirely. Lords who discovered that their titles couldn't fill their stomachs began working alongside their serfs in the fields, searching for any edible plants that might have survived the endless rain. Knights sold their armor and weapons for bags of grain. Some aristocrats fled their estates entirely, becoming wandering beggars indistinguishable from the common people they had once ruled. The Great Famine was destroying more than crops and livestock. It was destroying the psychological foundations of feudal authority, creating a crisis of legitimacy that would echo through European politics for centuries to come. And then came the winter of 1315 to 1316. The winter that broke medieval Europe's back completely. The winter that forced people to make a choice so devastating, so final, that it guaranteed the disaster would continue for years to come, no matter what the weather did. Because as the temperatures dropped and the endless rain turned to sleet and snow, as what little food remained became even scarcer, people began to eye the one thing they had been desperately trying to preserve: their seed grain. The precious stores of wheat, barley, and oats that represented next year's hope. The genetic heritage that their ancestors had carefully selected and saved for centuries. The only thing standing between temporary disaster and permanent catastrophe. Let me explain why this was such an impossible choice. Medieval agriculture worked on a cycle that required incredible discipline and long-term thinking. Every harvest, farmers had to set aside the very best grain for next year's planting. Not just any grain, mind you, but the plumpest, most perfect specimens, the seeds most likely to produce strong, healthy crops. This wasn't just agricultural planning. This was genetic stewardship stretching back generations. Some of these seed lines had been maintained by the same families for centuries, passed down from father to son like precious heirlooms, constantly improved through careful selection and patient cultivation. But when your children are dying in front of your eyes, when your wife hasn't eaten anything substantial in weeks, when you yourself are so weak from hunger that you can barely stand upright, suddenly that seed grain starts looking less like next year's hope and more like this week's survival. The internal debate that must have raged in thousands of households across Europe was heartbreaking. On one side, the rational voice saying, if we eat the seed grain, we'll have nothing to plant in the spring. We'll starve next year even if the weather improves. On the other side, the desperate voice responding, if we don't eat the seed grain, we'll be dead long before spring arrives. What good is planning for next year if there is no next year? And gradually, inevitably, desperation won. Families that had managed to preserve their seed stores through months of temptation finally broke down and consumed their future. They ground their seed wheat into flour and baked it into bread that tasted like hope mixed with despair. They boiled their seed barley into soup that represented both salvation and damnation. They ate their way through genetic heritage that had taken generations to develop, destroying in a matter of days what centuries of careful cultivation had created. But here's what made it even more tragic. People knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't ignorant desperation. This was informed desperation. Medieval farmers understood agriculture better than most modern people understand their own jobs. They knew with mathematical precision what eating their seed grain meant. They could calculate exactly how much wheat they needed to plant to feed their families next year. They understood the relationship between seed investment and harvest return better than modern stockbrokers understand their own portfolios. And they ate their seeds anyway, because the alternative was watching their families die in front of them. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine destroying your own future with full knowledge of what you're destroying. Imagine eating your children's inheritance, your grandchildren's hope, your community's genetic legacy, while knowing that each bite makes recovery less likely. These people weren't just consuming food. They were consuming time itself, trading away years of future prosperity for days of present survival. And the worst part? Once one family in a community ate their seed grain, it created pressure on everyone else to do the same. Because if your neighbor has no seed to plant in the spring, he's going to be even more desperate next year. He's going to be competing with you for whatever food is available. He's going to be more likely to steal, more likely to become violent, more likely to threaten your own family's survival. So you might as well eat your seeds too, because the community's agricultural future is already destroyed. It was like a tragic game of dominoes, where each family's individual decision to consume their seed grain made everyone else's decision easier and more inevitable. By the spring of 1316, vast areas of medieval Europe had literally eaten their own agricultural future. Regions that should have been planting thousands of acres found themselves with no seed grain whatsoever. The infrastructure of medieval farming, built up over centuries of patient work, had been consumed in a matter of months. Even if the weather had suddenly improved, even if the rain had stopped and the sun had started shining, there would have been no recovery because there was nothing left to plant. The Great Famine had become self-perpetuating, not because of continued bad weather, but because people had been forced to destroy the very mechanisms that could have enabled recovery. But here's the thing about human beings that never fails to amaze me. Even in the face of complete civilizational collapse, even when everything they had believed about morality and social order had been stripped away, even when they were forced to commit acts that would have been unthinkable just months earlier, people found ways to adapt. Not just to survive, mind you, but to create new forms of social organization, new moral frameworks, new ways of being human that somehow allowed them to maintain their sanity while living through hell on earth. It was like watching the birth of an entirely new civilization, one built not on abundance and divine right, but on shared trauma and collective desperation. Communities that had been rigidly hierarchical for centuries suddenly became radically egalitarian, not by choice but by necessity. When everyone is equally desperate, when everyone is committing the same survival crimes, when everyone is eating the same disgusting food, social distinctions start to seem like luxuries nobody can afford. Villages developed informal councils where decisions were made collectively, not because people had suddenly embraced democratic ideals, but because no single person had the resources or authority to make decisions for others. The old feudal system of lords commanding and peasants obeying simply didn't function when lords and peasants were competing for the same scraps of food. Perhaps most remarkably, people developed new moral categories that allowed them to maintain some sense of ethical behavior even while engaging in activities that would have horrified their former selves. Theft became redistribution. Murder became resource allocation. Cannibalism became honoring the dead by preventing waste. These weren't just euphemisms or self-deception. They were genuine attempts to create moral frameworks that could accommodate behaviors necessary for survival while preserving some sense of human dignity and social cohesion. Communities developed elaborate rules about what kinds of theft were acceptable and what kinds weren't. You could steal from someone who had more than you but not from someone who had less. You could take food from the dead but not from the living. You could eat human flesh if the person had died naturally, but not if you had killed them yourself. These distinctions might seem arbitrary to us, but they served a crucial psychological function. They allowed people to engage in survival behaviors without completely abandoning their sense of moral identity. They created boundaries that separated necessary evil from unnecessary evil, survival from savagery, human behavior from animal behavior. Families restructured themselves around survival rather than traditional relationships. Children who showed aptitude for foraging became the family scouts, regardless of their age or gender. Adults who proved skilled at processing unconventional foods became the community nutritionists. Elderly people who retained knowledge of survival techniques became respected advisors, regardless of their previous social status. It was a complete inversion of normal age and gender roles, where value was determined not by tradition or custom, but by immediate practical utility. And people developed psychological coping mechanisms that allowed them to maintain hope even in the face of overwhelming despair. They created elaborate fantasies about what life would be like when the famine ended. They developed rituals and ceremonies that provided structure and meaning in a world that seemed to have lost all structure and meaning. They told stories to their children that transformed current horrors into future legends, already beginning the process of turning trauma into narrative, suffering into mythology. Some communities developed forms of dark humor that allowed them to laugh at their own misery. Gallows humor that would have been inappropriate in normal times became a survival tool, a way of maintaining sanity when sanity seemed impossible. People made jokes about eating tree bark, about competing with rats for scraps, about the absurdity of their situation. It wasn't that they found their suffering funny. It was that they found laughter to be one of the few human responses that couldn't be taken away from them, no matter how desperate their circumstances became. But perhaps most impressively, people maintained their capacity for compassion and mutual aid even while engaging in behaviors that seemed completely selfish. Communities developed systems for sharing information about food sources, for protecting the most vulnerable members, for providing emotional support to families who had lost children or committed acts they couldn't live with. They created informal networks of psychological care, recognizing that surviving physically wasn't enough if you couldn't survive mentally. These weren't perfect systems. They were shot through with contradictions, hypocrisy, and moral compromises that would have been unacceptable in normal times. But they worked. They allowed human communities to persist through conditions that should have destroyed them completely. They demonstrated that even when civilization collapses, even when every social institution fails, even when people are forced to become things they never thought they could become, there's something irreducibly human that persists, something that continues to seek connection, meaning, and hope even in the darkest possible circumstances. And while ordinary people were developing these remarkable new forms of social organization, while they were creating new moral frameworks and survival communities from the ground up, something equally dramatic was happening to the institutions that had dominated European life for centuries. The church and the state, those twin pillars of medieval authority that had seemed as permanent and unshakable as mountains themselves, were crumbling like sandcastles in a hurricane. And the most devastating part? They were destroying themselves through their own incompetence, their own moral failures, their own inability to provide even the most basic functions that justified their existence in the first place. Let's start with the church, because this was supposed to be the institution that connected humanity directly to God. For centuries, medieval Christians had been told that the church was their intermediary with the divine, that priests and bishops possessed special powers to intercede on behalf of the faithful, that religious rituals and ceremonies could influence heaven itself to provide protection and prosperity. But when the rain started falling and wouldn't stop, when crops rotted in the fields despite elaborate blessing ceremonies, when thousands of faithful Christians starved to death despite fervent prayers and generous donations to the church, people started asking uncomfortable questions. If God really listened to church authorities, why was he apparently ignoring their desperate pleas for relief? If religious ceremonies really had divine power, why were they completely ineffective against meteorological reality? If the church really represented God's will on earth, why was God apparently willing to let the church's most devoted followers suffer and die in the most horrible ways imaginable? The psychological crisis this created was profound. Medieval Christianity wasn't just a religion. It was a complete explanation for how the universe worked. It promised that virtue would be rewarded, that faith would be protected, that God's justice would ultimately prevail. But the Great Famine seemed to violate all of these promises simultaneously. Virtuous people were starving while the wicked survived through theft and violence. Faithful Christians were dying horrible deaths while blasphemers who had abandoned all moral restraints managed to find food through criminal means. God's justice was nowhere to be found, unless you believed that God was actively punishing everyone equally for some incomprehensible cosmic sin. Church authorities made the crisis worse through their own moral failures. While parishioners starved, many priests and bishops continued to live in relative comfort, protected by church wealth that they refused to share with desperate communities. Monasteries that possessed large stores of grain often hoarded them rather than distributing them to the poor, claiming they needed to preserve church property for future generations. Some religious leaders used the crisis as an opportunity to demand even greater donations from people who had nothing left to give, promising divine intervention in exchange for whatever valuables desperate families might still possess. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Church doctrine taught that earthly possessions were meaningless, that true Christians should focus on spiritual rather than material concerns. But when the test came, when church leaders had the opportunity to demonstrate their own commitment to those teachings by sharing their wealth with starving believers, many chose self-preservation over charity. They proved that their dedication to Christian principles lasted only as long as those principles didn't require personal sacrifice. Meanwhile, secular authorities were proving equally useless. Kings who claimed divine right to rule couldn't even keep themselves fed, let alone manage the crisis effectively. Nobles who demanded absolute obedience from their subjects couldn't protect those subjects from starvation. Governments that claimed to represent order and justice instead created chaos through their incompetent policies and their inability to adapt to circumstances they didn't understand. The legal system, which was supposed to maintain social order, became a grotesque parody of justice. Courts were forced to prosecute thousands of people for survival crimes while ignoring the larger crime of governmental failure. Judges sentenced desperate parents to death for stealing bread while the authorities who had failed to prevent the crisis faced no consequences whatsoever. Laws that were supposed to protect property rights became tools of oppression that prevented communities from redistributing resources in ways that might have saved lives. But perhaps most damaging of all was the realization that these institutions had always been more fragile than anyone had understood. The divine right of kings turned out to be a political fiction that evaporated the moment kings proved unable to fulfill their basic obligations. The spiritual authority of the church turned out to be based more on social convention than on actual divine connection. The entire elaborate structure of medieval authority, with its ceremonies and hierarchies and theoretical justifications, was revealed to be a house of cards that collapsed the moment it faced a real test. People who had spent their lives believing that social institutions were permanent, divinely ordained features of reality suddenly understood that they were just human constructions, no more eternal or sacred than anything else humans had created. And once that understanding took hold, once people realized that authority figures were just fallible humans pretending to possess wisdom and power they didn't actually have, it became impossible to go back to the old unquestioning obedience. And while ordinary people were developing these remarkable new forms of social organization, while they were creating new moral frameworks and survival communities from the ground up, something equally dramatic was happening to the institutions that had dominated European life for centuries. The church and the state, those twin pillars of medieval authority that had seemed as permanent and unshakable as mountains themselves, were crumbling like sandcastles in a hurricane. And the most devastating part? They were destroying themselves through their own incompetence, their own moral failures, their own inability to provide even the most basic functions that justified their existence in the first place. Let's start with the church, because this was supposed to be the institution that connected humanity directly to God. For centuries, medieval Christians had been told that the church was their intermediary with the divine, that priests and bishops possessed special powers to intercede on behalf of the faithful, that religious rituals and ceremonies could influence heaven itself to provide protection and prosperity. But when the rain started falling and wouldn't stop, when crops rotted in the fields despite elaborate blessing ceremonies, when thousands of faithful Christians starved to death despite fervent prayers and generous donations to the church, people started asking uncomfortable questions. If God really listened to church authorities, why was he apparently ignoring their desperate pleas for relief? If religious ceremonies really had divine power, why were they completely ineffective against meteorological reality? If the church really represented God's will on earth, why was God apparently willing to let the church's most devoted followers suffer and die in the most horrible ways imaginable? The psychological crisis this created was profound. Medieval Christianity wasn't just a religion. It was a complete explanation for how the universe worked. It promised that virtue would be rewarded, that faith would be protected, that God's justice would ultimately prevail. But the Great Famine seemed to violate all of these promises simultaneously. Virtuous people were starving while the wicked survived through theft and violence. Faithful Christians were dying horrible deaths while blasphemers who had abandoned all moral restraints managed to find food through criminal means. God's justice was nowhere to be found, unless you believed that God was actively punishing everyone equally for some incomprehensible cosmic sin. Church authorities made the crisis worse through their own moral failures. While parishioners starved, many priests and bishops continued to live in relative comfort, protected by church wealth that they refused to share with desperate communities. Monasteries that possessed large stores of grain often hoarded them rather than distributing them to the poor, claiming they needed to preserve church property for future generations. Some religious leaders used the crisis as an opportunity to demand even greater donations from people who had nothing left to give, promising divine intervention in exchange for whatever valuables desperate families might still possess. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Church doctrine taught that earthly possessions were meaningless, that true Christians should focus on spiritual rather than material concerns. But when the test came, when church leaders had the opportunity to demonstrate their own commitment to those teachings by sharing their wealth with starving believers, many chose self-preservation over charity. They proved that their dedication to Christian principles lasted only as long as those principles didn't require personal sacrifice. Meanwhile, secular authorities were proving equally useless. Kings who claimed divine right to rule couldn't even keep themselves fed, let alone manage the crisis effectively. Nobles who demanded absolute obedience from their subjects couldn't protect those subjects from starvation. Governments that claimed to represent order and justice instead created chaos through their incompetent policies and their inability to adapt to circumstances they didn't understand. The legal system, which was supposed to maintain social order, became a grotesque parody of justice. Courts were forced to prosecute thousands of people for survival crimes while ignoring the larger crime of governmental failure. Judges sentenced desperate parents to death for stealing bread while the authorities who had failed to prevent the crisis faced no consequences whatsoever. Laws that were supposed to protect property rights became tools of oppression that prevented communities from redistributing resources in ways that might have saved lives. But perhaps most damaging of all was the realization that these institutions had always been more fragile than anyone had understood. The divine right of kings turned out to be a political fiction that evaporated the moment kings proved unable to fulfill their basic obligations. The spiritual authority of the church turned out to be based more on social convention than on actual divine connection. The entire elaborate structure of medieval authority, with its ceremonies and hierarchies and theoretical justifications, was revealed to be a house of cards that collapsed the moment it faced a real test. People who had spent their lives believing that social institutions were permanent, divinely ordained features of reality suddenly understood that they were just human constructions, no more eternal or sacred than anything else humans had created. And once that understanding took hold, once people realized that authority figures were just fallible humans pretending to possess wisdom and power they didn't actually have, it became impossible to go back to the old unquestioning obedience. But the most profound changes weren't in the fields or the granaries or the demographic statistics. The most profound changes were in the minds of the people who had survived this catastrophe. Because you can't live through the complete collapse of everything you believed about how the world works and emerge unchanged. You can't watch kings beg for bread and maintain the same reverence for royal authority. You can't see the church fail to provide divine protection and maintain the same faith in religious institutions. You can't commit acts that would have been unthinkable before the crisis and maintain the same moral certainties about human nature. The Great Famine had fundamentally rewired the medieval European mind, creating psychological and cultural changes that would influence the continent's development for centuries to come. First, and perhaps most importantly, it shattered the medieval assumption about social hierarchy being divinely ordained and permanent. Before 1315, most people genuinely believed that the social order was part of God's cosmic plan, that kings ruled and peasants farmed because that's how the universe was designed to function. But once you've seen a king crawling through the mud looking for scraps, once you've witnessed nobles and commoners eating the same tree bark and competing for the same rotten vegetables, that belief becomes impossible to maintain. The Great Famine proved that social distinctions were artificial human constructions that could be swept away by natural forces that didn't recognize crowns or coats of arms. This realization created what we might call the first stirrings of genuine democratic thought in European history. Not democracy as a political system, not yet, but democracy as a psychological recognition that all humans were fundamentally equal in their vulnerability, their mortality, their basic needs for food and shelter and security. It was a recognition that would eventually flower into the political revolutions that would reshape Europe in later centuries, but it began here, in the mud and desperation of the Great Famine years. Second, the crisis fundamentally altered European attitudes toward authority and expertise. People had learned the hard way that the individuals and institutions they had trusted to manage society were often incompetent, self-serving, and completely unprepared for real challenges. This created a healthy skepticism about claims to special wisdom or divine knowledge that would characterize European intellectual development for generations. When the next crisis came, and it did come in the form of the Black Death just 30 years later, people were much less willing to accept official explanations or follow official guidance without question. They had learned that authority figures were just as confused and helpless as everyone else, just better at hiding it. This skepticism would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment, all of which were built on the fundamental premise that traditional authorities might be wrong and needed to be challenged. Third, the famine created new forms of social organization based on practical cooperation rather than traditional hierarchy. Communities that had survived through mutual aid, shared decision-making, and collective resource management didn't immediately abandon these practices when the crisis ended. Villages that had learned to function as egalitarian survival units often maintained more democratic governance structures even after normal conditions returned. Trade networks that had developed to share scarce resources evolved into more sophisticated commercial relationships. The crisis had accidentally created a laboratory for social experimentation that produced innovations in community organization, economic cooperation, and political participation. Fourth, and perhaps most darkly, the Great Famine had normalized violence and moral compromise in ways that made European society more brutal and cynical for generations. People who had learned that survival sometimes required theft, violence, or even cannibalism didn't simply forget those lessons when times improved. Communities that had been forced to make impossible choices about who lived and who died developed a harder, more pragmatic approach to moral questions. This psychological transformation helps explain why the later medieval period was characterized by increased warfare, more brutal criminal justice, and a general coarsening of social relationships. The chivalric ideals that had flourished during the prosperous 13th century gave way to the much more ruthless and practical approaches to conflict that characterized the Hundred Years' War and other 14th century conflicts. Finally, the Great Famine marked the definitive end of medieval optimism about human progress and divine providence. The 13th century had been characterized by tremendous confidence in human institutions, religious faith, and social improvement. People believed that civilization was advancing, that each generation would be better off than the last, that God's plan was unfolding in ways that benefited humanity. But the catastrophic failure of every major institution during the famine years destroyed that optimism permanently. The later medieval period was characterized by much more pessimistic assumptions about human nature, divine justice, and social progress. This psychological shift prepared Europeans for the even greater disasters that were coming, but it also marked the end of an entire worldview that had sustained medieval civilization for centuries. So what does this impossible story teach us about power, about civilization, about what it really means to be human? Because when you strip away all the medieval details, all the specific historical circumstances, all the religious and political context that makes this seem like ancient history, you're left with some pretty uncomfortable truths about the nature of authority and the fragility of the systems we build to protect ourselves from chaos. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was essentially a massive stress test of medieval civilization, and medieval civilization failed that test spectacularly. But more than that, it revealed something profound about all human societies, all power structures, all claims to authority and expertise. It showed that when the fundamental requirements for human survival are threatened, when people are faced with genuine existential crisis, all the elaborate social constructions we create to organize our lives become irrelevant almost instantly. Kings, nobles, religious authorities, legal systems, economic structures, cultural traditions, all of it evaporates like morning mist when confronted with the simple biological reality that humans need calories to continue existing. And this isn't just a medieval phenomenon. This is a universal truth about human nature and social organization that applies just as much today as it did 7 centuries ago. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, when the COVID pandemic disrupted global supply chains, when natural disasters or economic crises threaten the basic infrastructure that supports modern life, we see exactly the same patterns. The people we normally consider powerful and important turn out to be just as vulnerable and helpless as everyone else. The institutions we trust to protect us prove inadequate to handle genuine emergencies. The social distinctions that seem so important in normal times become meaningless when everyone is struggling with the same fundamental challenges. But here's what I find most fascinating about the Great Famine story. It's not really a story about medieval Europe failing. It's a story about medieval Europe succeeding in ways that nobody expected, in ways that challenge our basic assumptions about what success even means. Because yes, the official institutions failed catastrophically. The kings and nobles and church leaders proved useless. The legal system collapsed. The economic structure disintegrated. But the people, the ordinary human beings who were supposedly at the bottom of this elaborate social pyramid, they survived. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough of them to rebuild, to continue, to create new forms of social organization that were often more resilient and more humane than what had come before. They discovered that they didn't need kings to organize their communities. They didn't need nobles to make decisions about resource allocation. They didn't need official religious authorities to maintain moral frameworks and provide psychological support. They could do all of these things themselves, often more effectively than the supposedly superior people who had been doing them before. And that's a lesson that's both inspiring and terrifying, because it suggests that most of the authority structures we take for granted are much more optional than we realize. It suggests that human beings are far more adaptable, far more capable of self-organization, far more resilient than the systems we create to govern them. But it also suggests that the comfortable stability we enjoy in normal times is much more fragile than we like to admit. The Great Famine also reveals something profound about the relationship between power and competence. Medieval kings claimed authority based on divine right, noble bloodlines, inherited legitimacy. But when the crisis came, what mattered wasn't their bloodlines or their divine connections. What mattered was their ability to solve problems, to adapt to changing circumstances, to provide genuine value to the people they claimed to lead. And by that measure they failed utterly. The people who proved most valuable during the crisis weren't the ones with the most impressive titles or the most elaborate ceremonies. They were the ones who knew how to find food in impossible circumstances, who could organize communities for mutual survival, who could maintain some semblance of human dignity and moral behavior even in the face of absolute desperation. The old grandmothers who remembered survival techniques. The children who could forage for insects and edible plants. The ordinary people who figured out how to make tree bark edible and how to catch rats for protein. These were the real leaders of medieval Europe during its darkest hour, even though history barely remembers their names. And that makes me wonder, when the next great crisis comes, and it will come because crises always do, who will be the real leaders? Will it be the people with the most impressive credentials and the highest social status? Or will it be the people who actually know how to solve problems, how to adapt, how to help their communities survive? The Great Famine suggests that being king means absolutely nothing when the world falls apart. But being human, being adaptable, being willing to help others and share knowledge and maintain hope in impossible circumstances, that means everything. And there you have it. The story of when medieval Europe ate tree bark and kings begged for bread. The story of how 3 years of impossible rain brought down a civilization that had seemed as permanent as the stones of its cathedrals. The story of human beings pushed far beyond their breaking point, discovering reserves of adaptability and resilience they never knew they possessed, while also discovering that the distance between civilization and savagery is much shorter than anyone wants to believe. It's a story that happened 700 years ago, but it feels uncomfortably relevant today, doesn't it? Because we live in our own elaborate social pyramid, with our own claims about divine right and natural order and inevitable progress. We have our own kings and nobles, even if we call them by different names. We have our own institutions that claim special wisdom and authority. We have our own assumptions about what's permanent and what's possible, about who deserves to eat and who deserves to starve, about what could never happen here in our time to our people. But the Great Famine reminds us that all of it, every single bit of the comfortable stability we take for granted, exists at the mercy of forces much larger than human authority, much more powerful than political systems, much more fundamental than economic theories. Climate, disease, natural disasters, the basic requirements of human biology, these don't care about our social hierarchies or our carefully constructed explanations for why things are the way they are. When the next crisis comes, and history suggests it always does, will we handle it better than medieval Europe did? Will our leaders prove more competent than King Edward II searching desperately for bread in St. Albans? Will our institutions prove more resilient than the medieval church organizing feudal processions while people starved? Will our economic systems prove more adaptable than feudalism collapsing under the weight of empty granaries? Or will we discover, as medieval people did, that most of what we consider sophisticated civilization is actually just a thin veneer covering the same basic human needs, the same fundamental vulnerabilities, the same capacity for both incredible cruelty and remarkable compassion that have defined our species since the beginning? The Great Famine story doesn't provide easy answers to these questions, but it does provide a powerful reminder that human history is much stranger, much more unpredictable, and much more instructive than we often realize. It reminds us that the past isn't just a collection of quaint stories about people who live differently than we do. It's a laboratory full of experiments in human behavior, social organization, crisis management, and survival that offer insights directly applicable to our own lives and our own uncertain future. If this story has fascinated you, if you've found yourself thinking about the parallels between medieval crisis and modern fragility, if you're curious about other moments when history took impossible turns that changed everything, then you're exactly the kind of person this channel is designed for. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we've got so many more of these incredible stories to explore. Next week, we're diving into the dancing plague of 1518, when entire towns were struck by a mysterious compulsion to dance until they collapsed from exhaustion, and some danced until they died. It's another story that sounds too bizarre to be true, another moment when the normal rules of reality seem to stop applying, another window into the strange corners of human experience that challenge everything we think we know about what's possible. And if you want to dive even deeper into these historical disasters, if you want to understand the connections between medieval crisis and modern vulnerability, check out the description below for links to additional resources, to books and articles and documentaries that explore these themes in even greater detail. Because the more you understand about how previous generations handled impossible circumstances, the better prepared you'll be for whatever impossible circumstances the future might bring. History isn't just about the past. It's about pattern recognition. It's about understanding the recurring themes of human experience. It's about learning from the successes and failures of people who faced challenges every bit as daunting as anything we face today. And sometimes, it's about finding inspiration in the most unlikely places, in stories of people who lost everything but somehow found ways to rebuild, to continue, to create something new from the ashes of what came before. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the darkest chapters in European history. Thank you for sticking with this story even when it got uncomfortable, even when it challenged assumptions you might have had about human nature and social stability. And thank you for being part of a community that believes history matters, that the past has something important to teach us, that understanding where we came from is essential for figuring out where we're going. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember that the distance between tree bark and bread, between king and beggar, between civilization and chaos, is always much smaller than we think.